You read the title. In today's video, we're talking all about how to set vocal levels in a mix. Are you ready? Let's go. What's going on, ladies and gentlemen? This is your boy 5-Piece, producer and engineer extraordinaire. Before we get into the topic of today's video, which is vocal mixing, I want to make you aware of a couple of things. The first thing is this video is somewhat of a spiritual successor to another video I have called How to Set Levels When Mixing. Now, the difference between that video and this one is that video was really focused on instrumental mixing, so setting the volume of your instrumental level, so kicks, basses, snares, pianos, things of that nature, all the instrumental components. I really focused on that in that video, and this one's going to be purely focused on vocal mixing and setting your vocal levels. That being said, there's going to be a lot of overlap between the two videos. There's obviously a lot of the same principles that apply to both, but I wanted to make sure that I got this one done for you because I know setting vocal levels is extremely important, and a lot of you guys also struggle with getting your vocals to cut. In fact, when I'm mixing for artists, one common thing that I notice is their vocals are buried and they struggle with actually getting them to cut on top of an instrumental. So in this video, I'm going to cover that. I'm going to let you know how you should be thinking about setting your vocal levels. And the key thing here is it's not going to be a straightforward walkthrough. I know you guys are probably wondering, how do you set the volume fader? And that's where your head is at. This video is going to cover that, but it's going to cover a few other areas. In fact, we're going to talk about 4 different things that you should be mindful of when it comes to setting your vocal levels. So I'm going to break that down throughout this video, and feel free to use the chapter markers down below once you feel like you've understood something and you want to skip ahead and see something else. But I definitely advise that you pay attention throughout this whole video because I'm going to break down these 4 key areas and also link out to some of my other videos that are probably going to help continue to enhance the knowledge that you're getting. So maybe I might explain something a little bit better in another one of my videos, and I might not go so deep into this one. With all that being said, let's jump onto Pro Tools and I'll show you what's going on. So the first thing that we need to be mindful of when it comes to setting vocal levels is actually track organization and how we structure our vocal mix, okay? I know this is really like step 0, but how you manage your gain is really a product of how you have your tracks organized and how they flow into one another. Now, I did break down how I set up my instrumental mix in another video, and I definitely recommend that you check out that video so you can see how I've structured that. Right now, I'm going to focus purely on how I structure my vocals, and the way that I like to think about it is I think of it as a 3-step pyramid. Okay, on the bottom of that pyramid is my individual tracks, right? So this is like my leads, my main vocals, my hooks, my verses, my ad-libs, all the stuff, right? All the individual components that make up a vocal performance, all the final edited takes, this is going to be on that bottom level of the pyramid. And what's going to happen is everything is going to flow up into the next level. And what I mean by that is the next level up is the subgroups, okay? The subgroups is basically like a master for all the levels. So all of your individual vocal tracks are going to flow up to these subgroups, and what's going to happen is you're going to be able to control the overall level of every vocal with that one section. Now, one level above that, of course, is the vocal master, okay? This is where every single group goes as well. Now, this is obviously a 3-step process in a much bigger process or system. So what I mean by that is, while we do have these 3 breakdowns, what happens is you have the same thing happening more or less equally on the instrumental side, and then in the end, you're going to have 2 masters, a instrumental and a vocal master that you're going to be able to balance with each other and then use for final mastering. So with that being said, let me just exemplify fully what I said. I talked about the individual vocal tracks, and on this track here, this mix, you know, this is what we're looking at, right? We have all of these individual components, right? And we're basically using them, and these essentially make up the actual performance of the track, all these individual tracks, and I have control of each of their individual levels, as well as obviously their own set of plugins, right? Now, this is obviously the first thing that we're going to focus on when we start setting levels, but what's going to happen is all of these tracks are eventually going to flow or output. As you can see, I have them all outputting to a specific destination here on the IO side of things to a subgroup, right? And this is my main vocal subgroup. Now, you might be wondering, what kind of subgroups do I have? Well, typically I'll have 2 or 3 subgroups. The first one is a main vox, as you can see. Another one is a vocal effects, all vocal effects. So as you can see, I have medium delay, short delay, reverb, slaps, all kinds of stuff, right? All kinds of effects and I have them going to their own group, subgroup, right? And what happens is this group and the main Vox group are basically parallel. They're beside each other, and as a result, I can control the level because maybe I want to turn down the effects or automate the effects even at a certain point and make sure that they're less in the way of the main vocal. And as you can imagine, this main vocal is dry. There's no effects actually being applied directly here. They're happening here on this sort of parallel channel, so to speak, or parallel channels. So I have control over those, and they ultimately both feed up to the same vocal master output, right? And that's going to ultimately allow me to then control those two even more so before we actually get to the mastering level. Now, one additional subgroup that I don't have in this mix, but you might want to have, is a background vocal master. So what that would usually contain for me is background vocals, harmonies, ad-libs, any kind of more secondary vocal, anything that's really not the lead. Whereas this group typically for me is going to be your main lead hooks, your main verses, the main stuff that should be front and center. They're going to go to this main Vox. All your effects are going to go to your all Vox effects. And then ultimately that other potential subgroup that I propose, the background Vox, would be all your ad-libs, harmonies, and things of that nature. The stuff that should still be prioritized, but secondary compared to the lead stuff. So just to exemplify this a little bit further, I've shown you my subgroups, and all those subgroups are ultimately going to feed this, what I've titled Acapella Master. Okay, so now what I'm going to be able to do is control the overall volume here of every single vocal, right? Every vocal feeds to this, so as I turn it up and down, I'm manipulating all of them equally. Now, of course, when I'm setting my levels, I'm pretty much not going to want to touch this, and I'll get into this a little bit more later. I'm really going to focus on first setting my individual track levels, and then I'm going to move a step up, and I'm going to set my group levels, my subgroup levels, and then one step up from there, I'm going to maybe readdress my acapella master level where all the vocal subgroups and all the individual tracks ultimately go. And by balancing those two, I'll be able to then find a nice blend for the master. Hopefully this makes sense, but the first thing that we ultimately need to do is structure our mix properly, structure our vocal mix properly, so that way we have multiple levels of gain control. Because with this, as you can see, I'm able to manipulate volume on the individual track level, the subgroup level, the master level, and then I have a bunch of different ways to manipulate them in between as well, whether it's by putting a gain plugin on or even by adjusting the clip gain, which we're going to talk about in this coming section. Now, the next thing that we want to do is gain staging. I want to clarify what this is because this is not necessarily us setting volume levels just yet. In fact, that's going to be the next step. But gain staging is just how we play with the gain structure, how we play with the volume to ultimately ensure that it's loud and full, but at the same time, make sure that it's not overwhelming and clipping, okay? And what I find happens to me as a mixer when I'm mixing other people's stuff is they're recording their vocals way too loud. And what happens is they're clipping before we even get to the mixing phase, okay? And that's very problematic because we ultimately need to have headroom in order to fully hear something clearly and also be able to turn it up later through other processes. So if I'm already clipping before I do any processing, I'm already running into issues. And not only that, you're probably going to already have some weird artifacts or other problems that you're going to need to address, or maybe you just can't address it all because it's essentially broken at the recording level. And as I mentioned earlier in this video, I have a video all about how to set vocal recording levels, so definitely check that out because it's going to help you with this. But let's talk about a couple of scenarios, okay? So first, let's actually just pay attention to, let's say, this track, okay? I have all of my levels just out at 0, and all I have is my auto-tune on, so there's no processing. And just to be super thorough, I'll mute my vocal effects because I know I have some reverbs and delays. But what we're going to do is we're going to just focus on this section. Let's just say right here for now. And let's just pay attention and see how much level we have here on the hook, right? I want to make sure we have headroom. And to make it super simple, I'll switch this over to peak so we can see exactly how much of a difference we have before the clipping point, okay? So this is how much headroom we have at any given moment. Here we go.
With a sun low, make my great escape. Yeah, you don't know. I've been trying to get going, but I'm sitting low. Should we call off? Should we keep going? Depending what you want to do.
So as you can see, we have quite a bit of headroom. At any given moment, it's anywhere from 16 to 20 dB of headroom from 0, right? We have that much room before we hit digital 0 and clip. And this is a good thing in my case. I want to have a lot of headroom to be able to do additional things, because if I add a compressor and then drive up the makeup gain, if I add some saturation, if I do certain processes that you'll probably notice I do in a lot of my mixes, especially if you watch some of my vocal chain type videos, you'll know that I'm going to eventually get closer and closer to zero. And as long as I have enough headroom available, I could basically push the volume of this and not run into any issues. However, what I find happens sometimes, as I alluded to, is sometimes artists are giving me vocals that are extremely loud. So for example, I'll get a vocal that's cranked, right? So if I were to crank this, and this is probably going to be horrible, but let's just do it for the sake of an example, you're going to see that I'm probably not going to have as much headroom now that I've cranked this up by 20. You know what? Just to be safe, I'll put it up by, let's say, 17.
With a sun low, make my great escape. Yeah, you don't know, I've been trying to get going, but I'm sitting low. Should we call it off?
Well, I'm actually extremely impressed that I am not clipping at this point. I definitely should be, but you can hear the audible distortion, right? I'm pushing this up right now, 25 dB, which is definitely not something you're going to want to do, but I'm just obviously pointing it out to show you what sometimes I'm given. And in this case, I should actually be clipping noticeably, like my peak should be way past zero, even though it's staying at zero. Perhaps there's some sort of limiting happening because of the auto-tune here. But nonetheless, if I'm running into a situation where I'm clipping and hitting the red and surpassing digital zero, it's going to be difficult to even just set my levels. I could definitely set them, but I'm already clipping before we even get to that point. So what I'm actually suggesting you do is that you go into the audio clip especially and do the opposite of what I just did. You saw me take the clip gain and increase it. I actually would recommend doing the opposite, right? Decrease it, right? And typically your peak meter, which is what I have displaying here, will say, you're clipping by 2 dB. It'll say 2 over 0, right? Or 3 or 4, whatever it is. Whatever that number is, you're going to want to turn your vocal track, your actual audio clip in this case, down so it's less than that number, okay? So as an example, if it says we're peaking by 2 dB, I'm going to want to set this so that I'm just beyond 2 dB, if not more so. I maybe want to create even more headroom, right? So as an example, if I'm clipping by 2 dB and I set this to minus 2.1, what's going to happen is I'll now be 0.1 under digital zero, and I should no longer be clipping at that point. However, as I kind of mentioned, you'll still be close enough that you won't have any headroom. And again, if you're planning on doing some additional processing, you're going to run into an issue here. So what you're going to want to do is create even more headroom, right? So maybe I'll push it down to, minus 5. And again, with that 2 dB over example, I should now have at least 3 dB of headroom. Truthfully, you want as much headroom as possible, but there's sort of two extremes here. If you have too much headroom, when you go to turn up a sound later, what's going to happen is you're going to be increasing the noise floor. There's always a natural noise floor on every recording. In fact, you may have noticed it when I just pushed this example here, right? You may have heard that all of a sudden you were hearing more of the background noise and fuzziness and all kinds of stuff that's happening more quietly, but the second that I crank everything up, it makes it way more noticeable. This is usually like a hiss type of sound, right? And that's obviously not a good thing. We want to avoid having that. But at the same time, we also need to avoid the extreme, which is clipping. So we're trying to find this middle ground where we're not, setting things too quietly, where if we turn it up later, we're bringing up the noise floor. But then at the same time, where it's not too loud, and then we're creating this clipping, right? You have to obviously manage these two extremes and find that perfect middle ground. So what I usually suggest is try to have it so that you have anywhere from 6 to 16 dB of headroom, okay? I know that's quite a big number, and the truth is it's really going to depend because it's all about how it's perceived, right? It's perceived loudness, and as much as it is about loudness and mixing with your eyes, it really is about just how it sounds and how it sits in a mix, and you might find that sometimes having it a little bit closer to minus 6, still having that 6 dB of headroom is pretty good for you, but at the same time, you might find that's still too loud and you go over when you add processing. So you're going to want to maybe steer a little bit closer to that minus 16. But ultimately, what I'm getting at is before you even set your levels, you could just leave them right now at 0 dB and focus on simply managing the actual gain of the audio file itself. Most DAWs allow you to do this. And in the event that your DAW doesn't allow you to do this, the next best thing is to put on some sort of gain or trim type of plugin. So as an example, Pro Tools has trim, and I could just use the gain here to now create that additional level of headroom. However, for me personally, I love using the actual clip gain built into a channel because the other benefit too is I could decide what to actually give headroom to. So for example, you see that this piece of audio is significantly quieter than these. I could actually go in and not have that one be turned down and then have these actually get turned down and everything else around it as well. Hopefully that makes sense, but overall what I'm trying to get at here is just make sure that you have enough headroom to work with in the first place before you even set your levels, even if that means leaving everything at 0, playing through your track one time, and then manipulating the gain staging structure or the clip gain to create that headroom. Of course, you might be wondering, hey, well, isn't that going to just make things super quiet? Yes, it will, but at the same time, you're going to be able to turn things up later, right, by using your volume fader, right? And at the same time, we're going to be able to create additional room by reducing the instrumental. That's the other thing that's obviously going to be one of the first steps that we do. So now we get to the real meat and potatoes of the video, which is setting your volume fader levels. Now, this is really what you came to this video for, I'm sure, but those other points were really important because you really need to do them first in order to do this next part correctly. You can't really do this without being organized and having things structured properly and making sure that there's headroom, more importantly, to actually turn things up and increase them in volume or just set the volume appropriately. Now, that being said, you may have noticed I was alluding to setting your instrumental volume first, and that is actually the big key here. So what I'll do is when I'm first starting a mix, I will actually mute my acapella master. Then I'll go to my instrumental and I'll set it to 0. So that way it's just unity gain. And I'm also going to make sure that I don't have any mastering on my master channel, but I'm ultimately going to reduce this to infinite and then bring it up in volume, but try to make sure that I have enough room on my master so that way I can actually have the combination of both my instrumental and acapella combined while still making sure that there's headroom. Now, that being said, we want to make sure that the instrumental is low enough so that way the acapella can cut on top, because I find a big mistake that a lot of people make is they leave the instrumental right at 0 at unity, and then they're trying to push all the individual vocal tracks to be extremely loud and compete on top of it, and that just creates way more issues. The easier thing to do is actually to reduce the volume of the instrumental so that way you have room to actually hear your vocals and then set your volume accordingly. What I like to do is I like to have somewhere between -7 to -10 dB of headroom on my master track, and what that means is typically if you're dealing with a mastered track, a mastered 2 track like I am here, you pretty much are going to want to set your volume anywhere from -7 to -10. Sometimes it could be more or less, but I find that's a pretty good barrier because whatever you set that to will essentially be the same in terms of peak volume. So let me actually flip my view mode here. Here's my instrumental and here's my mastering. So on my mastering, this is my peak volume down here. I'm just going to quickly play a moment of this and let's just see roughly where it's landing, and I'll adjust my instrumental volume as a result. So that's pretty good. You see that obviously it's going to change depending on what's being played, right? So when a drum hit happens, of course, it's a little bit louder, right, than when it's not happening, right? But either way, we're somewhere in that range of -7 to -10, and that's pretty good. And as you can see here, my volume on my instrumental, I set it to -7.5, and that seemed to create the amount of headroom that we need. So now that we've done that, I'm going to go in and set our vocal levels, and I'm going to give you some pointers here. But first things first, let's unmute this acapella master, and I'm going to leave it at unity gain at 0 dB, so we're not adding and we're not taking away. We want to fully focus on manipulating the individual track out sounds first, and then down the line, we can come back in and adjust the group volume. But first things first, we need to get the levels of the individual sounds set. Now, what I like to do is I like to focus on generally the busiest section of a sequence, and that's typically the hook. An alternative is you could definitely mix this in sequence in terms of what appears first. So I have an intro here, I have an intro hook, I have a verse. I could mix these in one by the order of appearance that they appear in, but I honestly think it's much easier and better to mix around the busiest section, which is typically the hook once again, because if I could set my vocal volume there, then typically that volume will work across the board. And of course, I'm going to make some additional adjustments, but at least I can get the volume set appropriately and make sure that's going to be cutting on top of the instrumental specifically. So really, we have two goals here. The first one is to make sure that we get an optimal volume. What that means is we want to maximize the loudness, right? And get a blend that we like, okay? That doesn't necessarily mean you need to crank it and make it as loud as it possibly can, but we want to make it as loud as possible while at the same time making sure that we're getting it to where we want it to be, right? So if you get it to a level that you like, That's pretty much what we're going for here. But we have to have that additional consideration of the second factor, which is we want to make sure that we're not clipping, okay? You always want to avoid clipping, and honestly, you shouldn't be clipping if we did that other step correctly where you created headroom. But at the same time, sometimes what happens is you go a little bit too crazy and you might push it too far and then make your vocal track clip as a result. That being said, we're trying to focus on these two principles: maximizing loudness and getting that blend that you like, and 2, avoiding clipping. So that being said, I'm going to actually group all my tracks together, and I'm going to take all the vocal tracks and bring them down to infinite, so that way none of them are audible, right? So if I play this section, we're not going to hear anything. So that's good, right? We heard the instrumental, that's okay, but we don't want to be hearing any vocals, okay? So now that I've done that, I'm going to take off my group, and I'm going to go to my main vocal here. And we usually mix the mains first, right? We're not going to mix ad-libs or backgrounds. You want to do your mains first and make sure that you can get them to sit up front. And all I'm going to do is I'm going to play this and increase the volume and try to find the level. Now, one note that I want to make is don't worry about what the number is. A lot of people get obsessed with the number. It doesn't matter. All that matters is, as we bring this up, is that you have headroom and that you're getting the amount of volume that you want. It's loud enough that you could get the blend that you want from it. So let's do this. I'm going to set this all the way to infinite and play.
But it's a late night. We gotta go, and I don't know anymore where I'm gonna do, where I'm gonna go on a late night. Yeah, you don't know. Anyway, what you wanna do. There's a million reasons why I should let go of you.
All right, so it's a little bit dry and there are supposed to be some effects here, but as you can tell, I'm doing this dry on purpose. I want to try to get that initial level down, and then I can start adding my effects before they start to create biases in my decision making, right? But as you can tell, I've set this to +2, right? So I've made this 2 dB louder than 0, and I'm not clipping. Everything is sounding good. I'm liking what it sounds like. I could hear the vocal fairly clearly, but it's also not too overpowering, at least from my current vantage point. I am using headphones. I definitely recommend referencing this in a few different situations, headphones and on speakers, but I'm using headphones to avoid any kind of headphone bleed and whatnot for the sake of this video. Now, you might be wondering, what if you have several vocal tracks, right? Maybe you have a bunch of stacks, so a couple of harmonies and backgrounds. You're going to want to blend them in at the same time as well after you set your initial level here. So for example, I have 2 other vocal tracks here. These are some whisper tracks. They're panned left and right. And now that I've set my main vocal sound, my main lead here, I could go in and I could turn up both of these and set their levels appropriately. Now keep in mind, one is on the left, one is on the right. So this is basically a stereo pair. I'm going to actually group them together, which I already have. And I'm just going to play this and increase the volume. And I'm going to tell you some considerations afterwards, but we're going to have the same sort of thing. We're just going to bring them up so that we could feel their presence or hear them. In this case, it's more of a feel thing than it is a hear thing. And just make sure that we are not clipping on both of these channels. And then as a secondary effect, we're going to want to double check and make sure that we're not clipping our group. Okay, this is the main Vox group where all those tracks are going to. So let's do this real quick.
But it's a late night. We gotta go, and I don't know anymore where I'm gonna do, where I'm gonna go on a late night. Yeah, you don't know. Anyway, you wanna do. There's a million reasons why I should let go of you. Somebody still sticking around. I don't know what to do if I give you all my mind, but I never do. I'm still spending all this time traveling on late.
There's a little ASMR there for some of you guys, for all the fans out there, but as you could tell, this is more about the feeling than it is about actually hearing it. I definitely want to feel that presence of the whisper. It's just supposed to thicken things up a little bit. We've set the levels. They're, of course, not clipping. And now, and this applies to pretty much any other stack of vocals that you're doing, because as you have more tracks combining, right? So if you had a lead and several backgrounds or harmonies, they're all going to be combining in volume, and they're going to potentially cause your group to clip. We want to make sure that doesn't happen. So I'm going to double check this right now. I'm pretty sure we're not clipping, but let's just visually see and confirm.
Late night, we gotta go, and I don't know anymore.
Right, right? So we still got plenty of headroom for sure. And that's a good thing, right? But let's say that you don't have the headroom in this situation. What you could do is you can actually group your tracks together and basically turn them down an equal amount of volume, right? Now I could easily do some Pro Tools by grouping those tracks. And let's say that we're clipping by a little bit. I could turn them down by 2 or 3 dB. I could preserve the relationship between them as a result of that grouping. But ultimately what's going to happen is I'm going to maintain that relationship and then at the same time create more headroom and prevent that clipping from happening. And then I could later turn things up after the fact by, increasing the volume of the bus that it feeds to. And the final step when it comes to setting your vocal levels is you're going to want to automate volume. We've worked through the process here, got our tracks organized, we've made sure that we have headroom, or we've created additional headroom with clip gain if needed, or maybe with another plugin. We've set our actual volume levels on the tracks, and right now everything is good. But the thing is, as your track sort of unfolds, there's going to be a variance in volume at times, right? Some sections are going to be louder than others. Some tracks are going to get a little bit more congested or muddy, or they're going to fade into the background during more busier sections, and you're going to want to deal with all this stuff. And the thing is, really, you're not going to be able to just set a static volume level and have that be good enough. Like, you're always going to have to do some additional automation or some other type of maneuver like that, dynamic maneuver, so that way your vocal tracks cut at different times. There's really 2 ways in my mind that I like to do this, okay? My preferred way usually is to use clip gain, okay? So I showed you this in that earlier step, but let's say I wanted to have this be a little bit louder, right? And it's not because of a visual. Maybe like as I'm listening, I just can't hear this phrase as clearly as the others, right? Well, what I could do is I could crop this moment out, as you just saw me do. And then I could grab the clip gain, the actual gain tied to that clip, and turn it up. And now this is going to be, in this case, 4.4 dB louder, okay? You'd want to do this for anything that is too quiet in a mix. And of course, you could do the opposite, right? Let's suggest that this first track is too loud. I can go in and I could turn it down. Now, the only thing that you have to be mindful of by doing this method is it applies before your actual vocal chain, okay? So if I have a compressor, if I'm increasing this now, this is going to now trigger that compressor potentially more so than how it was when it was at 0, right? Because now it's 4 dB louder. Same thing here. Maybe I was getting a certain amount of compression on this phrase that I like. Well, by reducing this volume, maybe I'm not going to get that same type of articulation. And that obviously carries forward into everything that's going to be in your vocal chain. So definitely be mindful that if you do this, it's sort of happening first in the signal flow, and that could be problematic. Now, let's say that you have done your processing, right? Everything you have is perfectly fine. You have EQs, compressors, saturators, all that stuff. And now what you want to do is you want to make sure that that stuff is preserved, but then bring out or reduce parts that are just too problematic. Another thing that you could do, the alternative way from clip gain, is to just use volume automation, right? So similar type of premise, except volume automation would be happening last in the chain after all of your plugins. So this is a great way to preserve what you have in there and just ultimately adjust the volume slightly, okay? And of course I can go in here and let's say I want to turn this down, I turn it down, go into the next phrase, turn it up. And obviously I'm doing this sort of point blank at random, but you're going to want to listen through and make those adjustments step by step. Now, a third and final suggestion is you can use an automatic type of plugin or a smart plugin. So for example, one that I've talked about in some of my other videos, because I have a video out there called Smart Plugins That Make You Mix Faster. I'll leave a link to that up above if you want to check it out. But I use this plugin called Vocal Rider. And Vocal Rider is essentially an automatic volume fader, and it almost works like a compressor in a way where you sort of set a threshold and whatnot and you give it a range. And I can basically have it be focused on a certain point. So like let's say that anytime it gets too loud, I want to reduce it by 1. And anytime it gets too quiet, I want to increase it by 1. Well, now I could set that up and I could just set my sensitivity up at the same time. So let's actually just do this real quick.
But it's a late night, we gotta go, and I don't know anymore what I'm gonna do. But it's a late.
So you see it working and doing some stuff as this plays through, right? Really, it's reducing almost the tail end at times for specific phrases. Some phrases like this one, it's not really doing a whole lot. But other moments, it's of course just dynamically reducing when it needs to. But at the same time, what it'll do is it'll increase when I need it to do that. Similarly, what I could do is I could also just leave this at 0 and then add 2 dB of gain. So what this is doing is this is only going to reduce extremely loud moments, but then increase the level overall by 2 dB, for example.
But it's a late night, we gotta go, and I don't know anymore. But it's a late night, we gotta go, and I don't know anymore.
Hopefully you get the point. I'm doing this fairly quickly, but I'm just showing you that there's another automatic type of way to do this where you don't necessarily have to go and draw everything in. But I'm going to be honest, I find that manually doing things, manually drawing in the automation or adjusting the clip gain is usually the best approach, or some combination of the three. Sometimes you want to go in and clip gain a few things so that you get a certain reaction out of your plugins, and then you want to do some volume automation on the end, but maybe do that volume automation after Vocal Rider has done most of the heavy lifting, because it'll do obviously a lot of the work depending on how you set it up. Now, with all that being said, all of these processes are obviously applicable for the most part to your subgroups and your submasters. I obviously am encouraging that you first and foremost focus on your individual tracks. I've given you a couple of key tips here that you can implement, but at the same time, once you've gone through and done this to your individual tracks, take it up one step further and do the same thing on your groups, okay? So as an example, once I've set all my individual vocal levels, I'm going to now go into the group and increase or decrease that level and set it appropriately, because maybe, everything is adding up and it's sounding great, but it's a little bit too loud, so I want to just reduce it a little bit. Truthfully, after I've set all my levels on my vocal side, I'm always going to go back into my acapella master, bring it down to nothing, and essentially reset it so that I can get a better balance with the instrumental. And once I have a really solid groove or relationship between the two, I might group them together and then do some further adjustment, maybe increasing or decreasing them to, increase or decrease headroom. But either way, these are a few different tips that I've used and continue to use when it comes to setting levels, getting organized, setting clip gain and making sure that I have headroom, going in and actually setting the volume itself, and then of course automating that volume where I need to so that way I can get different vocal tracks to cut. So I hope you found this video helpful. If you did, please smash that like button till it turns blue. And if you're new here and you haven't subscribed yet, please subscribe to the channel as well, because I drop a new piece of content just like this every single week, always focused on helping you sound better and helping you make more money with your music. I'd love to continue helping you improve your craft and get better on this journey, but at the same time, I need you to do the small things. Just like the video and subscribe to the channel. It's 100% for free. It doesn't cost you anything but a little bit of effort, and it would go a long way to not only helping me, but helping you. I appreciate y'all for watching. If you want to see anything in a future video, definitely leave it in the comments below. And I'm looking forward to helping you again on the next one. All right? Peace.
5.